In 1945, Britain stood at the height of its power. The empire spanned a quarter of the globe. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. London was the financial centre of the world. Winston Churchill had just led the Allies to victory against Nazi Germany. The British pound was the global reserve currency. From India to Canada, from Australia to South Africa, the sun never set on British territory. And then, in the space of just 20 years, it was all gone. The largest empire in human history dissolved faster than anyone thought possible. India gained independence in 1947. The Suez Crisis humiliated Britain in 1956. By 1967, the pound was devalued and Britain was begging for loans from the International Monetary Fund. The empire that had ruled the waves for 3 centuries became a declining European power dependent on American protection. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The destruction of the British Empire wasn't caused by independence movements or military defeats or economic collapse. It was caused by a single piece of legislation passed in the United States Congress in 1944, a bill that most people have never heard of, a bill that fundamentally rewrote the rules of international finance and guaranteed that Britain would lose its empire within a generation. Before we get started, smash the like button and subscribe if you love financial deep dives. Comment your city and the time you're watching this. I want to see how global this community is. This is the story of how one American law destroyed the greatest empire the world had ever seen, how Franklin Roosevelt systematically dismantled British power while pretending to be their ally, and how the British government willingly signed their own death warrant because they had no choice. The bill was called the Bretton Woods Agreement, and it changed everything. Before we understand how this law destroyed Britain, you need to understand what made the British Empire possible in the first place. It wasn't just military conquest or industrial superiority. It was financial control. For over 2 centuries, London controlled the global monetary system through the gold standard and the British pound. Every major international transaction was conducted in pounds. Every central bank held British government bonds as reserves. Every shipping route, every trade deal, every colonial export flowed through the City of London. This gave Britain enormous power over the global economy. When other countries needed to buy goods internationally, they had to acquire British pounds first. When governments needed to borrow money for development projects, they borrowed from British banks at British interest rates. When commodities like wheat, cotton, or rubber were traded globally, the transactions happened in London using British currency. This system was called the sterling area, and it encompassed nearly half the world's population. Countries from India to Egypt to Malaysia conducted their international business in British pounds and held their foreign reserves in London banks. But financial control gave Britain more than just economic advantage. It gave them political leverage over every country in the system. If a colony or dominion stepped out of line, Britain could restrict their access to pounds, making international trade impossible. If a foreign government pursued policies London disapproved of, British banks could cut off lending. The pound wasn't just a currency, it was an instrument of imperial control, and everyone understood this arrangement. The British maintained their empire not just through gunboat diplomacy, but through monetary dominance. Then came World War II, and everything changed. By 1940, Britain was fighting for survival. The German U-boat campaign had cut off vital supply routes. The Royal Air Force was burning through aircraft faster than factories could replace them. British gold reserves were hemorrhaging as the government bought weapons and supplies from neutral countries. Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced a terrible choice. Continue fighting alone and risk complete financial collapse, or seek assistance from the United States and accept whatever terms the Americans demanded. Churchill chose to fight, but the price would be higher than anyone imagined. In March 1941, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. Officially, this law allowed America to provide military equipment to Britain without immediate payment. Destroyers, aircraft, tanks, ammunition, food supplies. Everything Britain needed to continue the war effort. President Franklin Roosevelt sold this to the American public as a way to keep America out of the war, while supporting democracy against fascism. Britain would pay back the United States after victory was achieved. It seemed like a generous arrangement between allies, but buried in the Lend-Lease legislation were conditions that would fundamentally alter the global financial system. The Americans demanded that Britain agree to dismantle the sterling area after the war. They required that British colonies be open to American trade on equal terms with British companies. They insisted that the pound sterling's special status as an international reserve currency be eliminated. These weren't suggestions, they were requirements for receiving American aid, and Britain had no choice but to accept. Roosevelt and his advisors understood exactly what they were doing. They were systematically dismantling the financial architecture that made the British Empire possible. While publicly supporting Britain's war effort, they were privately engineering Britain's decline as a global power. The Lend-Lease Act wasn't just about military aid, it was about transferring imperial control from London to Washington, and the British government knew it. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most influential economist and the chief negotiator with the Americans, wrote privately that accepting Lend-Lease terms would mean the liquidation of the British Empire. He warned that agreeing to American financial conditions would make Britain virtually a puppet of the United States after the war. But Churchill's government had run out of alternatives. German submarines were sinking British merchant ships faster than replacements could be built. The Royal Navy was stretched to breaking point, defending convoys across the Atlantic. British cities were being bombed nightly during the Blitz. Without American aid, Britain would face either conquest by Nazi Germany or negotiated surrender on German terms. So they signed, and with that signature, the countdown to imperial collapse began. But the Lend-Lease Act was just the beginning. Roosevelt and his economic advisors, led by Harry Dexter White at the Treasury Department, had a much more comprehensive plan to reshape the global financial system. They were preparing for a post-war conference that would establish new rules for international trade and monetary policy, rules that would ensure American dominance and British decline. The conference would be held at a resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, and the agreement reached there would complete the destruction of British financial power that Lend-Lease had begun. The British delegation to Bretton Woods was led by John Maynard Keynes, the most respected economist of his generation. Keynes understood exactly what was at stake. He knew that control of the international monetary system was the foundation of imperial power. Whoever controlled global finance would control global politics. For 2 centuries, that had been Britain. Now the Americans wanted to take over. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods hoping to preserve some element of British influence in the new system. He proposed a compromise arrangement where both the dollar and the pound would serve as international reserve currencies. He suggested creating a new international currency that would reduce both British and American dominance. But the Americans held all the cards. By 1944, the United States controlled over 60% of global gold reserves. American industrial production had tripled during the war, while British industry was focused entirely on military equipment. The American economy was larger than the rest of the Allied powers combined. Roosevelt's delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, wasn't interested in compromise. They wanted complete American control of the post-war financial system, and they had the economic power to demand it. The negotiations at Bretton Woods lasted 3 weeks. 29 countries sent delegations, but only 2 really mattered, the Americans and the British. Every other nation understood that whatever agreement emerged would be dictated by these 2 powers. The conference rooms were filled with technical discussions about exchange rates and currency convertibility and international reserve requirements. But underneath the diplomatic language, everyone knew what was really happening. The transfer of global financial supremacy from London to Washington AC from London to Washington. The terms the Americans presented were devastating for British interests. Under the proposed Bretton Woods system, the US dollar would become the world's primary reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. All other currencies, including the British pound, would be pegged to the dollar rather than gold. This meant that international trade would shift from pounds to dollars. Central banks would hold dollars instead of pounds as their primary reserves. The City of London would lose its position as the centre of global finance to Wall Street. Keynes fought desperately against these terms. He argued that making the dollar the sole reserve currency would give America too much power over the global economy. He warned that pegging all currencies to the dollar would allow American monetary policy to dictate economic conditions worldwide. He proposed alternative arrangements that would preserve some role for sterling in international finance. But his arguments fell on deaf ears. The American delegation made it clear that these were the terms. Take them or leave them. The British had no leverage to negotiate. Their economy was shattered by 6 years of total war. Government debt had increased by over 400% since 1939. Exports had collapsed as British factories focused on military production. The country was entirely dependent on American loans just to avoid bankruptcy. When Keynes cabled London for instructions, Churchill's government told him to accept whatever terms were necessary. Britain needed American financial support to survive the transition to peacetime. They couldn't afford to walk away from Bretton Woods. On July 22, 1944, representatives from 44 nations signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. The new system would take effect after the war ended. The dollar would replace the pound as the world's reserve currency. International trade would shift from sterling to dollars. The Federal Reserve would effectively become the central bank for the global economy. Britain had just agreed to dismantle the financial foundation of their empire. But the full implications weren't immediately obvious. In 1944, Britain was still fighting a world war. The empire remained intact. British forces controlled vast territories from Burma to Egypt. The Royal Navy still patrolled the world's oceans. Colonial administrators in India and Africa continued governing hundreds of millions of subjects. To most observers, Britain appeared to remain a great power. The financial changes seemed like technical adjustments that wouldn't affect political reality. They were catastrophically wrong. The first shock came in 1945, immediately after Germany surrendered. President Harry Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April, abruptly cancelled all Lend-Lease aid to Britain. The war in Europe was over, Truman announced. American assistance was no longer necessary. Britain would have to pay cash for any future purchases of American goods. This decision caught the British government completely off guard. They had assumed that Lend-Lease would continue until Japan surrendered, giving them time to rebuild their export industries. Instead, they faced an immediate financial crisis. The numbers were staggering. Britain owed the United States over $21 billion in Lend-Lease debt. Their annual export earnings were less than $2 billion. At current rates, it would take over a decade just to pay back wartime borrowing, assuming they could maintain a massive trade surplus with America. But British industry couldn't compete with American manufacturers, who had spent the war years modernizing their factories, while British plants focused on military equipment. The trade deficit with America was growing, not shrinking. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, traveled to Washington in the autumn of 1945 to negotiate emergency financing. The Americans agreed to provide a loan of $3.75 billion, but the conditions were even more severe than Lend-Lease had been. Britain would have to make the pound convertible within 1 year, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at fixed rates. They would have to eliminate all trade preferences within the empire, opening colonial markets to American companies on equal terms with British firms. They would have to accept American oversight of their economic policies. These weren't normal loan conditions. They were designed to complete the dismantling of British financial power that Bretton Woods had begun. Making the pound convertible would drain Britain's dollar reserves as investors converted pounds to dollars. Eliminating imperial trade preferences would destroy the economic relationships that held the empire together. American oversight would reduce British economic sovereignty to that of a client state. Again, the British had no choice but to accept. Without American financing, the government faced immediate bankruptcy. Rationing would have to continue indefinitely. Industrial reconstruction would be impossible. The welfare state promised to British voters during the war could never be implemented. Clement Attlee's Labour government, which had won a landslide victory in 1945 on promises of social reform, would collapse within months. So they signed the loan agreement in December 1945, and the final destruction of British imperial power began. The consequences were immediate and devastating. When the pound became convertible in July 1947, exactly as the Americans had demanded, investors immediately began converting their pounds to dollars. Why hold a currency from a declining, debt-ridden country when you could hold dollars backed by the world's strongest economy? Within 6 weeks, Britain lost over $1 billion from their reserves. The government was forced to suspend convertibility after just 39 days, but the damage was done. The pound had been exposed as a weak currency that couldn't maintain its value without artificial support. Meanwhile, the elimination of imperial trade preferences was destroying the economic bonds that held the empire together. For decades, British colonies had been required to sell their raw materials to Britain at below market prices and buy British manufactured goods at above market prices. This arrangement had transferred enormous wealth from the colonies to the mother country, funding Britain's industrial development and naval supremacy. Now American companies could compete on equal terms for colonial markets and resources. The results were predictable. Indian cotton went to American textile mills instead of British factories. Malayan rubber was sold to American tire companies rather than British manufacturers. African copper was shipped to American smelters instead of British refineries. The wealth that had flowed from the periphery to London for 2 centuries began flowing from the periphery to New York and Detroit instead. Colonial governments suddenly realized they no longer needed Britain to access global markets. If American companies would pay higher prices for their exports and sell manufactured goods more cheaply than British firms, why maintain the imperial connection? The economic logic of empire had been shattered by American financial policy. Political independence became not just possible, but economically attractive. The first domino fell in India. The Indian independence movement had been building for decades, but British control had seemed permanent as long as London controlled global finance. Indian exports had to be sold through British banks in pounds sterling. Indian imports had to be financed through the City of London. This gave Britain enormous leverage over Indian politics, regardless of local opinion. But after Bretton Woods, this leverage evaporated. Indian businesses could sell their goods for dollars and buy imports with dollar financing from American banks. The Reserve Bank of India could hold dollars instead of pounds as foreign reserves. Economically, India no longer needed Britain. When Lord Mountbatten arrived in Delhi as the last viceroy in March 1947, he found a situation that had fundamentally changed. British financial control over India had already ended. Political control was now meaningless less. The independence of India in August 1947 sent shockwaves through the remaining empire. If Britain couldn't hold on to the crown jewel, the source of wealth that had funded imperial expansion for 2 centuries, what hope did they have of maintaining control anywhere else? Colonial administrators across Africa and Asia watched nervously as the precedent was set. The economic foundations of empire were crumbling, and everyone could see it happening, but the real devastation was still to come. The Bretton Woods system wasn't just changing how international trade worked, it was systematically redirecting global capital flows away from London and toward New York. Every transaction that had previously required British pounds now used American dollars instead. Every central bank that had held British government bonds as reserves was quietly converting to US Treasury securities. Every shipping route that had generated profits for British banks was now enriching American financial institutions. The sterling area, that vast network of countries conducting business in British currency, began fragmenting almost immediately. Australia announced in 1949 that they would hold dollars alongside pounds in their reserves. Canada had already pegged their currency to the dollar rather than sterling. South Africa was quietly negotiating trade deals denominated in dollars rather than pounds. The centrifugal forces that had held the empire together for centuries were now pulling it apart. British officials watched helplessly as their global influence evaporated. The Treasury calculated that Britain was losing approximately $2 billion annually in financial services revenue as business migrated to Wall Street. Insurance policies that had been written in London were now being underwritten in New York. Commodity trades that had been financed through British banks were now handled by American institutions. The invisible exports that had made Britain wealthy were disappearing. Winston Churchill, now in opposition after losing the 1945 election, understood exactly what was happening. In private conversations with conservative colleagues, he admitted that accepting American financial terms had been a catastrophic mistake. Britain had traded temporary wartime survival for permanent post-war decline. The Americans had achieved through economic policy what no military enemy had ever accomplished. They had broken British power without firing a shot. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the vital waterway that connected Britain to its remaining Asian possessions. Prime Minister Anthony Eden decided this was where Britain would make its stand. The canal was too important to British interests to allow Egyptian control. British forces, alongside French and Israeli allies, launched a military operation to retake the canal and remove Nasser from power. The operation was a complete military success. British paratroopers captured the canal zone within days. Egyptian forces were routed. Nasser's government was on the verge of collapse. But then the Americans intervened, not with military force, but with financial pressure that proved far more effective than any army. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious that Britain had launched the operation without consulting Washington. The Suez Crisis threatened to damage American relations with Arab countries at a time when the Cold War was intensifying. Eisenhower decided to teach Britain a lesson about who really controlled the global economy. He ordered the Federal Reserve to stop supporting the British pound in currency markets. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Without American support, the pound began falling rapidly against the dollar. British gold reserves, already depleted from years of economic crisis, started hemorrhaging as investors converted pounds to dollars. Within weeks, Britain faced a full-scale currency crisis that threatened to bankrupt the government. The Treasury calculated that they had perhaps days before the pound collapsed completely. Harold Macmillan, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, flew to Washington to beg for American assistance. The message from the Eisenhower administration was crystal clear. End the Suez operation immediately and withdraw all British forces from Egypt. Only then would America consider stabilizing the pound. Britain had no choice. Despite military victory on the ground, they ordered a complete withdrawal from Suez within weeks of the invasion. The humiliation was complete. Britain, the former ruler of the seas, had been forced to abandon a successful military operation by American financial pressure. The Royal Navy, which had dominated global shipping routes for 3 centuries, couldn't protect British interests against American economic warfare. Every remaining colony and dominion witnessed this demonstration of British weakness. If Britain couldn't defend the Suez Canal, what could they defend? The psychological impact of Suez was devastating. For generations, British identity had been built around global leadership and naval supremacy. The idea that Britain ruled the waves was fundamental to how the nation saw itself. Now everyone understood that American financial power could override British military force whenever Washington chose to exercise it. The empire wasn't just declining economically, it was being actively dismantled by its supposed ally. Decolonization accelerated dramatically after Suez. Ghana gained independence in 1957, followed by Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Kenya in 1963. Each independence movement followed the same pattern. Local leaders recognized that Britain could no longer provide economic benefits or military protection. American companies offered better trade terms than British firms. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund, both dominated by American policy, provided development financing that made colonial dependence unnecessary. And that's how the Bretton Woods Agreement destroyed the British Empire. Not through revolution or military defeat, but through financial engineering that systematically transferred global economic control from London to Washington. Roosevelt and his advisors understood something that most people miss about imperial power. Empires aren't built on armies or territories. They're built on controlling the money, and once you lose control of the global financial system, everything else collapses inevitably. The British learned this lesson the hard way, watching 3 centuries of dominance evaporate in 2 decades because they signed agreements they couldn't afford to refuse.